1943. German engineers perfected a weapon with a specific purpose. It was not designed to kill. Killing was too merciful for the enemy. Death was too cheap. The S-mine had a different logic. A dead soldier only requires a wooden grave and a name on a list. He is removed from the battlefield forever. But a wounded soldier creates a burden. The German designers focused on a specific outcome: permanent mutilation. A man torn in half is a corpse. A man deprived of his legs and genitals is a logistical nightmare. He requires a field hospital, a team of surgeons, and months of expensive rehabilitation. He becomes a living drain on his army's resources. Even worse, he remains a permanent reminder of the war's horror to everyone who is not yet hit. Why choose injury over death? The answer was simple. It was a matter of mathematics and psychology. A wounded man occupies 4 healthy soldiers to carry him. He fills a hospital bed. He screams in the barracks. Lieutenant Colonel Sloan studied mine warfare after the conflict ended. He analyzed every explosive device used by the Axis powers. His conclusion was absolute. Sloan called the S-mine the most terrifying device Allied forces encountered during the entire war. The footage shows the mechanism, a steel canister filled with 360 steel balls. When triggered, a small charge launches the mine into the air. It explodes at waist height. There was no mistake in the design. It was a machine built for maximum agony. The soldiers nicknamed it the Bouncing Betty. The logic of the engineers was cold. It worked. One mine could paralyze an entire company. It didn't just stop and advance. It destroyed the will to fight. The terror was calculated. Jumping Betty. That was the nickname American infantrymen gave it. Dark humor was their only defense against the stress of the front lines, but the French were the first to face this weapon in September 1939. They gave it a more accurate name: the Silent Soldier. It was a weapon that guarded its position without sleep. It felt no fatigue. It knew no fear. It required no human to kill. German factories produced almost 2 million of these mines over the next decade. Workers packed them into crates and shipped them to every front. They were sown like grass on the beaches of Normandy. They were buried deep in Italian soil. They were scattered across the frozen Eastern Front. When the war finally ended, the danger remained. Men had to remove them from the earth with their bare hands. One mistake meant death. This is the story of how a small steel cylinder became the most hated weapon of World War II. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation of secrets. The Treaty of Versailles prohibited a modern army. On paper, Germany was disarmed. In reality, military engineers worked in closed laboratories. They solved problems that officially did not exist. One task was clear: they needed a defensive weapon that did not require a human presence. How do you create an invisible sentry? They wanted a machine to guard positions day and night in any weather. Anti-personnel mines already existed, but they were inefficient. A soldier stepped on a mine. The charge exploded under his foot. One victim, one charge. German engineers wanted to change this ratio. They wanted one mine to take out an entire squad. The solution came from physics. An explosion at ground level is a waste of energy. The earth absorbs most of the blast. But what if the charge was higher? If the mine detonated at the height of 1 meter, the fragments would fly horizontally. The steel would strike the most vulnerable parts of the human body. The design was elegant and cruel. They created a 2-stage mechanism. First, a small powder charge fired the mine out of the ground. Then, at waist height, the main TNT charge detonated. It was surrounded by a shell of 360 steel balls. In 1935, the Schrapnellmine 35 entered service. It looked like a simple metal can. The steel cylinder stood 13 centimeters high. It was 10 centimeters in diameter and weighed 4 kilograms. It was easy to carry and easy to hide. The footage shows how it worked. Soldiers dug a small hole and dropped the cylinder inside. They covered it with dirt and leaves. Only 3 thin metal antennae remained on the surface. They were nearly invisible in the grass. It took only 7 kilograms of pressure to activate the fuse. The sound of a faint hiss was the only warning. Then, the jump. Thus began the era of the most lethal mine in history. September 7th, 1939. 1 week after the German invasion of Poland, the French army launched a cautious offensive in the Saar region. 11 divisions crossed the border. This was an attempt to fulfill Allied obligations to a dying Poland. The main forces of the Wehrmacht were fighting in the east. French commanders expected an easy advance deep into German territory. They predicted a collapse of the German border guards. The first few kilometers confirmed these expectations. German units withdrew without a fight. They left behind empty trenches and untouched roads. French intelligence reported no serious resistance. Then, the losses began. Soldiers fell for no apparent reason. There was no sound of a gunshot. There was no familiar whistle of an incoming shell. Explosions came from below. They happened simultaneously within the ranks. It looked as if the earth itself attacked the soldiers. The survivors were confused. Their reports were incredulous. The footage would have shown a quiet click, a short pause of 3 heartbeats. Then, an object flew out from under their feet. It exploded at face level. Those within a 20-meter radius died instantly. Those further away were hit by steel shrapnel. They lay in the grass, afraid to move. Why did the offensive stop? It wasn't the German army. It wasn't a lack of supplies. 11 divisions simply stopped. By September 11th, the offensive stalled. No enemy counterattacks occurred. The French retreated to their starting positions. The soldiers refused to advance. Every step became a lottery. Every meter of grass hid a potential death. No orders could force a man to move when the ground kills. Events accelerated. French intelligence gathered the first descriptions of the new weapon. They sent the reports to Allied headquarters. The device received a nickname. They called it the Silent Soldier. This name would stick forever. The report was filed. The advance was over. Thus ended the Saar offensive. 1943. Allied sappers sat in makeshift tents, clutching technical diagrams and dismantled metal casings. They needed to understand why this weapon was turning the battlefield into a graveyard. The device looked simple. At first glance, a standard steel cylinder, but in reality, a complex death trap. The outer shell was ordinary steel. Inside sat a second, smaller cylinder. The gap between these 2 layers was packed tight. Some versions used steel balls, others used chopped metal rods. It depended on which factory produced the batch. At the very core of the inner cylinder sat 200 grams of TNT. Below the TNT was a separate chamber. It contained black powder. This was the same combustible material used in 18th century muskets. Here, it served a different purpose. It was the lifting charge. The detonator was a study in lethal engineering. 3 metal prongs protruded from the top. These prongs connected to a percussion cap held back by a spring. Pressure from a boot compressed that spring. The cap struck the detonator. The reaction became irreversible. But the real terror was the delay. 4 seconds passed between the activation and the launch. This was a deliberate calculation. It was enough time for a soldier to take 2 more steps, enough time for his squad mates to hear a metallic click and move closer to investigate. Then, the black powder ignited. It punched the inner cylinder into the air. The mine jumped to a height of 90 centimeters to 1.5 meters. 3 detonators fired in unison while the device was mid-air. 350 steel balls sprayed outward in a horizontal circle. The velocity was high enough to punch through bone and muscle. The height of the blast was not accidental. It was chosen with anatomical precision. The pellets targeted the pelvis, the thighs, and the lower abdomen. This is where the largest arteries and vital organs are located. The footage from field hospitals confirms the result. These injuries rarely caused instant death. Instead, they caused permanent disability. Why was this effective? A dead soldier requires only a wooden cross. A wounded soldier requires 4 stretcher bearers, a surgeon, a hospital bed, and months of expensive care. He becomes a burden on the military machine. He is a walking reminder of the war's cost to every soldier who sees him. The German command saw the results in the Saar region. They were convinced. Production moved to an industrial scale. Factories in Munich and Berlin began mass-producing the Schrapnellmine. By 1945, the total number of units exceeded 1,900,000. The weapon was everywhere. But the systematic mass use of these mines reached its peak with a specific arrival. Erwin Rommel took over as Inspector of Defenses. The Desert Fox had a new plan for the Atlantic Wall, 5,000 miles of coastline. This was the Atlantic Wall. The concrete bunkers and heavy coastal batteries looked imposing, but the reality was different. There were too few fortifications. The defensive lines stretched too thin. Allied planes controlled the sky, and their warships dominated the sea. The Germans needed a different solution. Erwin Rommel looked at the map and made a choice. He bet on mines. He focused on the islands of Saint-Malo off the coast of Normandy. Allied intelligence believed heavy artillery was hidden there. Rommel gave an order that changed the nature of the war. S-mines were to be planted like grass. He didn't want thousands, he wanted millions. By June 1944, the west coast of France was a death trap. It was the most extensive minefield in human history. Shrapnel mines surrounded every concrete bunker. They blocked every forest path. They waited under the sand of every landing beach. The Germans created a layered system. They combined anti-personnel S-mines with heavy-teller anti-tank mines. It was a trap within a trap. The logic was brutal. If a mine blew the tracks off an armored vehicle, the crew had to evacuate. But as soon as their boots hit the ground, they triggered the jumping mines. There was no escape. But what about the Allied response? Events moved to America. Pierre Delalande, a French engineer, had fled his occupied country. He carried blueprints for the Model 1939. This was a French copy of the original German S-mine. He handed the designs to the Americans. The U.S. military rushed the weapon into production. They called it the M2. It was a total failure. The design was unreliable, and the firing mechanism was too temperamental for the mud of the battlefield. The mines regularly malfunctioned or failed to detonate. The Americans could not replicate the German engineering. They had to wait until the end of the war to capture functional samples. Only then did they understand the mechanism. In the frame, a soldier steps on a pressure plate. A small charge launches the canister waist-high. Steel balls spray in every direction. The footage shows the results. Metal shreds everything within 20 yards. This was the Bouncing Betty. It became the most feared weapon on the Western Front. The strategy worked. Rommel didn't need more soldiers. He just needed more steel in the ground. The price of every meter of French soil was paid in blood. June 6, 1944. At dawn, the first landing craft hit the Normandy sand. Beneath the boots of the infantry, hundreds of thousands of mines waited in total silence. The landing at Utah Beach went well. Compared to the slaughter at Omaha Beach, the resistance was light, but the danger was hidden. The 12th Infantry Regiment recorded their first day of losses. Most casualties did not come from German machine guns, they came from the ground. Minefields caused the majority of deaths and amputations. The beach was secure, but the real work was just beginning. This task was as lethal as the assault itself. Mine clearance started immediately. The methods were primitive. Metal detectors were available, but they were heavy and unreliable. Most infantry units did not have them. The primary tool for a sapper was a bayonet. He would lie flat on his stomach. He would drive the blade into the sand at a 30-degree angle. He probed the ground centimeter by centimeter. The sound of metal hitting metal meant a strike. The sapper had to work fast but carefully. He would take a standard sewing needle and slide it into the fuse hole. This replaced the safety pin. Then, he unscrewed the mechanism by hand. One mistake triggered the 4-second delay. There was no second chance. In the dunes near the village of Poopville, the scale was massive. American teams cleared 15,000 mines in the first few days. That is 15,000 steel cylinders on one small stretch of coast. But the numbers were not the problem. The Bouncing Betty was a psychological weapon. Its mental impact was stronger than its blast. Allied soldiers learned a hard lesson. Fighting the Germans was one war. Fighting the mines was another. This second war did not end when the enemy retreated. The fear spread. Every open field, every thick forest, and every dirt crossroads was a potential trap. Rumors moved through the ranks. One myth was the most common. Soldiers believed the mine would not explode as long as they kept their foot on the trigger. They thought they could stand still and wait for help. This was a lie. It was a story born from desperation. In reality, the mechanism triggered the moment the pressure was applied. It didn't matter if the soldier ran or froze. The result was the same. The mine jumped and detonated at waist height. There was only one way to survive the activation. A soldier had to fall face down instantly. He had to pray that the horizontal spray of steel balls passed over his head. The British gave the mine a specific nickname. It described the nature of the groin injuries better than any medical report. They called them debollockers. The threat remained long after the front line moved. Thus began the slow clearing of France. Those who survived an encounter with the Bouncing Betty often remained men in name only. The explosion shredded limbs and destroyed lives. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. But for the Schrapnellmine 35, the work was just beginning. The west coast of Denmark was the problem. It became the most heavily mined stretch of coastline on the entire continent. Until the very end, Hitler was convinced that the main Allied invasion would land here. It was the shortest route to Berlin. 1.5 million mines lay hidden in the sand and dunes of Jutland. This turned the beaches into an impassable death zone. How could the civilians return? They could not. The population was barred from coastal villages. Fishermen could not reach the sea. The land was liberated from occupation, but it remained occupied by steel and explosives. The British command made a decision. It would spark decades of controversy. They decided the mines would be cleared by German prisoners of war. This created a legal crisis. The Geneva Convention of 1929 expressly prohibited using prisoners for dangerous work. But lawyers found a loophole. German soldiers were reclassified. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were labeled as surrendered enemy personnel. This wordplay formally removed them from the protection of the convention. More than 2,000 Germans were sent to the West Coast. Many were teenagers. These boys had been drafted in the final months of the war. Their training lasted only several days. The footage shows the reality. There was no protective equipment, no reinforced suits, no helmets. Bayonets and bare hands served as their only tools. The norm was 6 mines per hour per person. 5 young Germans crawled along the sand. They stayed at arm's length from each other. They used their fingers to unscrew the fuses from the mine casings. These were the same mines their own country had buried there a year earlier. Historian Thomas Tram Peterson reconstructed the statistics. The results were grim. The S-mines caused a 31% mortality rate among the sappers. This was a slaughter. By comparison, the wooden shoe anti-personnel mines killed 2 out of every 100. The Bouncing Betty proved equally deadly to those who planted it and those who tried to defuse it. By October 1945, the work was officially completed. 1,300,000 mines had been extracted from Danish soil. The cost was high. 149 dead, 165 seriously wounded, another 167 moderately wounded. In France, the scale was even greater. 48,000 German prisoners cleared 13 million mines. The cost was 1,709 lives. The mine was created by German engineers in the 1930s. It ended its journey by killing German youth. The beaches were finally empty, but the graveyards were full. Thus ended the story of the Bouncing Betty. May 1945, German engineers surrendered their blueprints and prototypes. American military specialists did not waste time. They began studying captured samples immediately. The Second World War proved a harsh point. The American M2 mine design was a failure. It was unreliable in the field. The German original, however, worked flawlessly every time. The decision was practical. In the 1950s, the M16 mine entered service with the United States Army. It was almost an exact replica of the German Schrapnellmine. The mechanics were identical. It utilized the same 2-stage ignition. It contained the same steel balls. It reached the exact same lift height before detonating. There was no innovation, only imitation. The Soviet Union followed the same logic. They developed the OZM series. Soviet designers simplified the process. They replaced individual balls with a cast iron casing. Upon detonation, the entire body shattered into fragments. Later, the OZM-72 appeared. It featured internal steel rods. This version was even closer to the German prototype from the 1930s. How widespread is this design? It is universal. These mines are still manufactured in Russia today. Yugoslavia produced the Prom 1. China manufactured the Type 69. Italy, Sweden, and Belgium followed suit. Dozens of nations released their own variants. Every single one was a direct descendant of that steel cylinder designed by German engineers. The Vietnam War created a new generation of victims. The American M16 and its Vietnamese clones waited in the humid jungles. They were buried in rice fields and hidden along patrol trails. The footage shows soldiers moving with extreme caution, but the mines were invisible. In 1968, veteran Fred Downs stepped on one. He lost his arm. He spent the rest of his life assisting the wounded. The statistics are grim. In Vietnam alone, the number of killed and injured by these mines exceeded 60,000 people. In 1997, the international community reacted. They signed the Ottawa Treaty to ban anti-personnel mines. The primary argument was simple. Jumping mines are designed to maim rather than kill. But did the world stop? Not entirely. The United States, Russia, and China refused to sign the agreement. Millions of these mines remain in storage. They sit in crates in dark warehouses across the globe. Meanwhile, thousands more stay in the ground. They are buried in Libya, Egypt, and former Warsaw Pact territories. Many are forgotten. Many cannot be safely removed. Original German documents gave the S-mine a shelf life of 2 to 7 years. Reality proved different. These devices remain active for decades. A quiet click occurs under a leather sole. That is all it takes. The Schrapnellmine was not the most powerful weapon of the war. It did not sink fleets or level cities, but it was a masterpiece of cold engineering. The goal was maximum suffering with minimum resources. Designers solved a technical problem. They wanted to disable multiple soldiers with a single charge. They studied human anatomy to find the answer. 1 meter in height is the crucial measurement. That is the level of the pelvis and the thighs. At this height, the blast does not kill instantly. It breaks the body. It ends a soldier's career and changes their destiny forever. This was not random cruelty. It was optimization. A wounded soldier is a burden. They require medical staff, transport, and long-term care. A dead soldier requires only a grave. German factories produced nearly 2 million mines over 10 years. Their successors are still in production today. The Ottawa Treaty slowed them down, but it did not stop the industry. The Bouncing Betty is not a relic in a glass case. It is a functional weapon. Its core principle remains effective. It strikes a human being at their most vulnerable point. It is still waiting.